Hi, this is the first lecture on Chapter 12, the nervous system and tissue. In lecture part 1, I will be providing you with an overview of the nervous system. I'm going to define what the nervous system is, also talk about what type of cells make up the nervous tissue. Then I'll talk about the pathway used for communication by the nervous system, and then we'll look at the two anatomical divisions of the nervous system, which is the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. I'll talk about how the nervous tissue is organized in both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and then we'll look at some of the functional divisions within the peripheral nervous system. Let's start off by defining what the nervous system is and what nervous tissue is composed of. The nervous system is a complex network of cells, including neurons and supporting cells, that transmit messages to various parts of the body and that coordinate and control many body activities. It's divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and we'll look more at each of these later on in this lecture video. The nervous tissue is a tissue found in the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. Nerves are pretty much bundles of nerve fibers or axons found in the peripheral nervous system. There are two major groups of cells in the nervous tissue. The first major group are neurons. Neurons are cells in the nervous tissue that generate and conduct electrical impulses, or in other words, action potentials, and communicate with other cells using chemical signals called neurotransmitters. Now, the second major group of cells are called glial cells, also known as neuroglia. These are supporting cells that do not transmit electrical impulses, but instead they support the activity of the neurons. And we'll talk more about these glial cells in part 3 of the nervous system chapter. Let me just introduce the names of these different glial cells to you. So there are actually 4 major groups of glial cells found within the central nervous system. This includes the oligodendrocytes, the ependymal cells, microglia, and astrocytes. Within the peripheral nervous system, we have the Schwann cells and we have satellite cells. Now, we know the nervous system is really important as a mode of communication within our bodies. We actually have 2 bodily systems that are really important in communication. We have the endocrine system, which uses hormones, and then we have the nervous system, which uses electrical impulses as well as chemical signals to communicate between cells in our body. The nervous system coordinates activities in the human body by communicating between sensory receptors, which you see pictured here, and tissues or organs, which are usually muscles and glands, that carry out some specific response. The key players in this pathway of communication are sensory receptors. Sensory receptors are a neuron or specialized cell that detects a stimulus and activates sensory neurons. Sensory neurons are also known as afferent neurons, and they transmit nerve signals from a sensory receptor to the central nervous system. So then, within the central nervous system, we have what are called interneurons. Interneurons are located in integration centers within the central nervous system, and these are usually located in the brainstem or the spinal cord. The interneurons are really important because they transmit signals between the sensory neurons or afferent neurons and what we call motor neurons. Motor neurons transmit nerve signals from the central nervous system to effectors, or also known as target tissues or organs. Effectors are usually muscles or glands, and they respond to the motor neurons and carry out some specific type of response in our body. The sensory or afferent neurons and the motor and efferent neurons are considered part of our peripheral nervous system, and so they are outside of the central nervous system. So now let's look at the 2 major anatomical divisions of the nervous system. This includes the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system and peripheral nervous system work together to coordinate activities within your body. The central nervous system is the division of the nervous system consisting of the brain and spinal cord, which you can see pictured here in purple. The brain and the spinal cord are both enclosed by the cranium and the vertebral column, so they are surrounded by a protective skeleton. The peripheral nervous system, on the other hand, is away from the center of our body, and that's why it's called peripheral. This includes the nervous tissue situated outside of the brain and spinal cord and consists of nerves and ganglia. And those are pictured as these yellow fibers that you see pictured here in this image outside of the central nervous system. The nerves are bundles of nerve fibers, also known as axons, wrapped in fibrous connective tissue within the peripheral nervous system. The main function of nerves is to transmit nerve signals throughout our body. So nerves can actually be very long. They can transmit signals from your spinal cord out to other tissues and organs of your body. And then we also have something known as ganglia. And you can see the ganglia pictured here. They look not like swellings in a nerve. And this is actually where the cell body of peripheral neurons are situated. So this is where you have one neuron connecting with another neuron, or in other words, synapsing with another neuron. So these ganglia, or singular ganglion, are going to be really important as integration centers. So they help to integrate information from many different neurons. So now let's take a quick look at the anatomy of a neuron and a nerve. So here on the left, you can see the anatomy of a neuron. We're going to be looking at this in more detail in part 2 of the nervous system chapter. So here you could see a single cell of the nervous system. A neuron typically consists of a cell body, which has the nucleus in the middle of that. And then it has these branches coming off of it called the dendrites. The term dendrite means branching. And these branches actually receive chemical signals. Then if you look at the other end here of the cell body, we see what's called the axon hillock. This is going to be really important in initiating an action potential. And if an action potential is initiated in a neuron, it's going to send an electrical signal down through this axon. Notice that this axon is surrounded by this covering, which is known as the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is actually a modified plasma membrane. So it's a fatty plasma membrane that actually helps to insulate the axon. It pretty much speeds up the rate that action potential or electrical signal moves through the axon. There's actually a special type of cell that makes up the myelin sheath. In the central nervous system, they're called oligodendrocytes. In the peripheral nervous system, they're called Schwann cells. Anyway, so as we look at this neuron here, we see that the axon is where the electrical signal is transmitted. And then it eventually reaches the end of the axon, which we call the axon terminals. And at the end of the axon terminals, that's where the neurotransmitters are going to be secreted. And that's going to then bind to receptors on another cell and cause changes within that other cell. Now, the cell that could be the target of the neuron could be something like a muscle cell, a gland cell, or it could be another neuron. Here we actually see the anatomy of a nerve. So a nerve is actually a bundle of axons or nerve fibers from many different neurons. If you look at the anatomy of a nerve, it should remind you a lot of the anatomy of the muscles, because we have these connective tissue layers that are dividing this nerve into different groups, and it's very similar to what we saw before when we looked at, again, the anatomy of a muscle. So we can see that surrounding the entire nerve is what we call the epineurium. And then you can see that the nerve is separated into these bundles of axons, and that is called a fascicle. And so surrounding each fascicle is a perineurium. So a fascicle, when we're talking about nerves, is a bundle of axons. And then here we have the individual axons, and surrounding each axon is what we call an endoneurium. And so you can actually see that a nerve itself is a bundle of many different axons. So there's many different neurons sending information through a single nerve. So whenever you damage a single nerve, you're damaging communication to many different parts of the body, and that information is actually coming from many different parts of the body. So it can have a really, great effect on how your body is able to function properly. So when we're looking at the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, there are a couple different terms used to describe how the nervous tissue is arranged. So the terms nerves and ganglia, as we saw before, are only used to describe structures in the peripheral nervous system. Similar structures in the central nervous system are called tracts and nuclei, respectively. So Tracts are going to be very similar to nerves. These are bundles of nerve fibers or axons wrapped in fibrous connective tissue, and they're only found in the central nervous system. They are found in the lighter areas of the central nervous system called white matter. So if you look at this cross-section or coronal section of the brain over here on the right, you can see that there's some areas that are lighter. Those lighter areas are where the tracts are found. And this is because they're lighter, it's called white matter. Over here, you can actually see a big chunk of the brain was removed. So we're looking actually inside the brain. And you can see all these little lines here. Those lines are actually the tracts within the brain. So these are actually bundles of axons that are surrounded by connective tissue. And the tracts are really important because they are transmitting nerve signals between different regions of the central nervous system. Nuclei, singular nucleus, are very similar to the ganglia that we saw in the peripheral nervous system. Nuclei refer to deep regions within the central nervous system where neuronal cell bodies are situated. So if you look again at this coronal section of the brain, you can see that there's some darker gray areas within the brain. These darker areas that you see are where the nuclei are located. So this is where we have neuronal cell bodies. They appear darker in the central nervous system, and therefore they're also called gray matter. Because there's a lot of neuronal cell bodies in these regions of the brain are really important in integrating and processing information from many neurons. The nervous tissue in the brain and the spinal cord can also be categorized as gray matter or white matter. Gray matter contains numerous cell bodies and synapses. And a synapse is where one neuron connects with another neuron. And within this gray matter, we have relatively few myelinated axons. The gray matter is located in the nuclei, again, these deep regions within the brain. Also, gray matter is found on the surface of the brain, which we call the cortex. When we're looking at the spinal cord, which is also part of the central nervous system, we can see that the gray matter is in the inside of the spinal cord in this butterfly-shaped center. Now, white matter contains relatively few cell bodies and is mostly composed of myelinated axons. It's located in the center of the brain, which you see as like this yellow color in the brain over here on the right. And it's located on the outer portion of the spinal cord. The lighter color is due to the fact that there's a lot of myelin located in the white matter. And myelin tends to be really fatty, and this gives this tissue that whiter or lighter color. Now let's talk about the functional divisions of the peripheral nervous system. So remember, the central nervous system is anatomically divided into the brain and the spinal cord. Now the peripheral nervous system consists of all the nerves and ganglia that extend out from the brainstem and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is functionally divided into what we call the sensory or afferent division and the motor or efferent division. Each sensory and motor division is further divided into a somatic and visceral division. So the sensory division is divided into the somatic sensory and visceral sensory division. And the motor division is divided into the somatic motor and visceral motor division. The motor or visceral division, as you see right here, is also known as the autonomic nervous system, which you've probably heard about. The autonomic nervous system is further subdivided into the sympathetic division, which initiates our fight or flight response. So it pretty much arouses our body by like increasing our heart rate, increasing our breathing rate, and so forth. And then we also have what we call the parasympathetic division. And these motor neurons are going to be really important in our rest and digest phase of our body. So these motor neurons help to calm our body down. They slow down our heart rate, they slow down our breathing rate, and they increase the rate of our digestion. So they increase activity in our digestive system. So let's define these different functional groups of the peripheral nervous system. So the sensory or afferent division, what it primarily does is detect stimuli and transmits information from sensory receptors to the central nervous system. Okay, so when we're talking about sensory neurons, which make up the sensory division, again, that's going to be sending signals towards the central nervous system from the periphery of our body. Okay, we can break down the sensory division into the somatic sensory division and visceral sensory division. So somatic means body, visceral means internal organs. Okay, so that might help you remember this a little bit. The somatic sensory division contains neurons that send sensory information that is consciously perceived from receptors in our body. So where do you consciously perceive sensations? Well, you perceive those from the skin, our muscles, our bones, and our joints. We can actually detect, we are conscious of the movement of our body and where our body is located. And there are specific sensory receptors within our muscles, our bones, our joints that can help detect the movement of our body and the location of our body parts. Now in our skin, we have like touch receptors, we have temperature receptors, pain receptors, and those are things, again, that we are conscious of, those sensations. You also have somatic sensory neurons that send information to our central nervous system from our special sense organs. And these include our eyes, our ears, our skin, our tongue, and our nose. Again, we are very conscious of these sensations. So these are all part of the somatic sensory division. Now, we have sensory neurons also that are part of our peripheral nervous system that are considered visceral sensory neurons. And these neurons send sensory information to our central nervous system that is not consciously perceived. So we're not really aware of these sensations as they are entering our central nervous system. And so these are monitored subconsciously. So these sensory neurons are sending information from sensory receptors of our internal organs, or in other words, our viscera. And that is why it's called the visceral sensory division. For example, your central nervous system is constantly receiving input from sensory receptors in your blood vessels that are detecting your blood pressure. Now, we're not consciously aware of our blood pressure. However, our brain is constantly monitoring this. Same thing with our heart rate. Our heart rate is being monitored by our central nervous system. And what is sending information to our central nervous system? That is the visceral sensory neurons that is doing that. Now, let's talk about the motor or efferent division, as you see over here on the right. The motor efferent division contains neurons that initiate and transmit information from the central nervous system to the effectors. Okay, so motor neurons are sending information away from the central nervous system to different organs and tissues of our body. The somatic motor neurons send motor output that is consciously or voluntarily controlled. So we are aware of these movements. This information is always going to be sent to our skeletal muscles. So the somatic motor division consists of somatic motor neurons, which we actually talked about in the skeletal muscle chapter. And these somatic motor neurons are always going to target, again, skeletal muscles. And it's going to cause contraction of these skeletal muscles and movements that we are conscious and aware of. Now, there also is another division of our peripheral nervous system known as the visceral motor division. Again, this is also called the autonomic nervous system because it happens autonomically. It's self-governed. We are not conscious of this. Now, the motor neurons of our autonomic nervous system send motor signals that are not consciously, or in other words, are involuntarily controlled. Okay, so we are not consciously controlling this. We are not voluntarily controlling this. These motor signals are all being controlled by our central nervous system without our conscious awareness. Motor neurons of the visceral motor division are going to target cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, which are the smooth muscle within the walls of our viscera or internal organs like our digestive system, or these motor neurons will target exocrine and endocrine glands. Remember, exocrine glands are glands that secrete substance onto epithelial surfaces. This includes digestive glands, sweat glands, and things like that. Endocrine glands refer to glands that secrete hormones into our blood. So the secretion of hormones as well as the secretions from exocrine glands are all going to be controlled by the autonomic nervous system, or in other words, the visceral motor division. And remember, the autonomic nervous system can be further divided into the sympathetic division and parasympathetic division. So for example, motor neurons of the sympathetic division are going to increase our heart rate, whereas motor neurons of the parasympathetic division would decrease our heart rate. All right, so the autonomic nervous system is going to be really important. You'll have an entire chapter on this in Anatomy and Physiology too. You want to remember that this is the visceral motor division of the peripheral nervous system that unconsciously controls smooth muscles of the viscera, cardiac muscles, and glands. And the word autonomic means self-governing. There are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. We have the sympathetic division. This is known as our fight or flight response, or in other words, it controls our fight or flight response. And it does this by doing things such as arousing our body for action, increasing our heart rate, increasing respiratory airflow. But the sympathetic division does inhibit digestion. And that makes sense. When you're running away from a bear, you don't need to be worrying about digesting your food. Now, the parasympathetic division is known as the rest and digest response. Okay, these motor neurons help to calm your body down, so they have a calming effect on your body. This is why meditation focuses so much on breathing and slowing down your breathing rate. Because when you slow down your breathing rate, it helps to activate your parasympathetic nervous system. And your parasympathetic nervous system slows down your heart rate, slows down your breathing rate. It helps to calm your body. It pretty much tells your body that you are safe. On top of that, the parasympathetic division contains motor neurons that help to stimulate digestion and helps to increase activity within your digestive system. All right, so let's do a couple review questions. All right, so take a second and pause this video and try to answer these 4 questions. All right, so number 1, tracts and nerves are composed of bundles of axons. Number 2, nuclei and ganglia are composed of clusters of neuronal cell bodies. Okay, number 3, which of the following are found in the central nervous system? Well, that would be tracts and nuclei. So tracts are the bundles of axons within the central nervous system, and nuclei would be the clusters of neuronal cell bodies. And then number 4, which of the following are found in the peripheral nervous system? That would be the nerves and the ganglia. Nerves are very similar to tracts. Those are bundles of axons. However, they're found in the peripheral nervous system. And ganglia are clusters of neuronal cell bodies. They're very similar to nuclei in their definition. However, ganglia, again, are found in the peripheral nervous system. All right, now take a couple seconds to see if you can answer the following 5 questions and pause the video. All right, so number 1, the darker regions or gray matter of the central nervous system are composed primarily of the cell bodies of neurons. Number 2, the lighter regions or white matter of the central nervous system are composed primarily of the axons of neurons. And again, the reason why they are lighter or white in color is because these axons tend to be myelinated, and that myelin sheath around the axon is very fatty, and that's what gives it the white color. Number 3, in the brain, neuronal cell bodies are concentrated in the blank. Circle all that are correct. So the neuronal cell bodies would be found in the nuclei as well as the gray matter. Okay, and again, nuclei are typically found in what we call gray matter, because where the nuclei are, that's tends to appear darker within the central nervous system. Number 4, which region of the brain is important in the integration and processing of information? That would be the gray matter, because that contains the neuronal cell bodies. Remember, gray matter can be found in the surface of the brain, known as the cortex, as well as the deeper gray matter areas known as the nuclei. And number 5, which regions of the brain are important in transmitting electrical signals between different areas? That would be the white matter, because that's where we're going to find the tracts, which are bundles of axons. All right, so I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please don't be afraid to reach out to me, and I will try to answer any questions that you have.